Hi everyone, thank you for joining us. I'm Abaigeal,
I'm Abbey.
and today we'll be presenting on behaviour management in the classroom. In this presentation, we'll talk about what behaviour is, how different behaviours will affect learning, why some students exhibit unhelpful behaviours, and ways we can overcome or change these behaviours in the classroom using the ABC model.
So what is behaviour? A behaviour is anything a person says or does. They can be overt, which is external to the person and can be seen to other people, or covert, which is internal to the person and can't be seen by other people. Our behaviour is shaped by a unique combination of our personal experience and environment. Some behaviours are built in, like instincts and reflexes, and other behaviours are learned. They develop based on our experience. We learn by interacting with our surroundings.
Behaviours can be helpful or unhelpful. Helpful behaviours are those which help us function fully and successfully in our environment, and unhelpful behaviours are those which interfere with this functioning. Straight away, most teachers can probably think of examples of their students showing both helpful and unhelpful behaviours for learning in the classroom. Some students show active listening while you're teaching, complete tasks on time, raise their hand before speaking, and seek help when they're unsure. They might work well with other students and offer to help around the classroom. We tend to label these students as the good, well-behaved kids. On the other hand, you might think of students who avoid tasks, call out, distract others, or don't participate in class. These are unhelpful behaviours for learning, and they can be disruptive and adverse. We tend to label these students the naughty kids. It's important to note that students may use unhelpful behaviours as a form of short-term relief. If they perceive a task as too difficult, feel anxious or distressed, and avoid the task, they may feel temporary relief at that time. They've successfully avoided a tricky task. However, the next time that task comes up and they use the same avoidance behaviour, they create a damaging cycle of unhelpful behaviour. This will inevitably affect their engagement in learning.
What actually causes, shapes, or maintains these behaviours? As mentioned, behaviours occur in a cycle. This cycle involves our thoughts, beliefs, feelings, and surroundings. Repetition is what maintains the cycle of behaviour. The ABC model is a tool we can use to understand how behaviours are formed and maintained, looking at what happens before, during, and after that behaviour. A stands for antecedent, the trigger. It's the stimulus or contingency in our environment that causes a behaviour. So this might come from an external source, such as events, situations, people, lighting, smell, or an internal source, which is within the person themselves, such as their mood or emotion, thoughts, motivations, physiological states, such as hunger, tiredness, or even having a headache. And B stands for behaviour. This is the specific behaviour that occurs due to the antecedent or trigger. C stands for consequence, the outcome. It's what happens immediately after the behaviour occurs. So this might be reinforcing to encourage more of a behaviour, or punishing to discourage the behaviour. The word punishing might seem confronting at first, considering the outdated classroom punishments that it has been associated with in the past. However, today, the word punishment holds much less severity, and it can be as simple as something as a verbal warning. When we say punishment, we mean the opposite of reinforcement.
Let's look at an example. A man is in a rush and running late for work. He gets in his car and is about to drive off, but he hears the seatbelt warning sound. He stops and remembers to put on his seatbelt. In this scenario, the antecedent is the sound, the behaviour is putting on his seatbelt, and consequence is avoiding a possible ticket or injury. His safety is reinforcing, which encourages repetition of that behaviour. Conversely, if the man was speeding in his car and was pulled over by a police officer, he would be issued a speeding fine. In this scenario, the antecedent is his mood. He's feeling stressed because he's late for work. The behaviour is speeding, and consequence is the speeding fine. The fine is a punishing consequence, which will discourage repetition of that behaviour.
The ABC approach is useful for understanding student behaviour in the classroom. What antecedent or trigger leads to an unhelpful behaviour, and what particular outcome or response, the consequence, might increase or decrease the likelihood of it happening again. In a classroom, we want to encourage helpful behaviours and reduce unhelpful behaviours for learning. But how? In the same way that behaviour can be learned, it can be unlearned. We can therefore apply the ABC model to modify student behaviour in the classroom by addressing the antecedents and consequences in the learning environment. Our aim is to alter the environment to help the student function more successfully and to practice alternative, helpful responses in replacement of the problematic, unhelpful behaviour.
We can look at managing or changing a behaviour using 3 simple steps. Step 1 is to identify the specific unhelpful behaviour. It's important that we identify a single observable behaviour so the student is fully aware which behaviour is being addressed. Consider this the starting behaviour. We then also want to decide on the alternative helpful behaviour, the final desired behaviour that we want to reinforce. For example, an unhelpful behaviour might be blurting out an answer, and the final desired behaviour would be raising their hand. Step 2 would be to identify the environmental, social, or personal triggers or consequences that are maintaining the specific problem behaviour. For the example of raising one's hand, an environmental trigger may be the competitive nature of the question, where a student wants to be the first to answer. Or a personal trigger might be if a student has ADHD and difficulty with inhibitory or impulse control. Alternatively, that same unhelpful behaviour may be maintained by its consequence, for example, getting a laugh from their peers. Step 3 is where the modification actually comes in. Our aim here is to modify the antecedent or consequence which we have identified. We either want to minimise or eliminate the trigger and/or modify the resulting consequence. Our overall aim is to ensure that the unhelpful behaviour is discouraged and simultaneously, the alternative helpful behaviour is being encouraged. Like we mentioned earlier, these two go hand in hand and must be consistent.
Let's look at these 3 steps in more detail using a classroom example. An unhelpful learning situation may be a student not completing a task or handing in their homework on time. The actual specific behaviour could be anything from task avoidance to forgetfulness to poor time management. For this example, let's consider task avoidance. You notice that a student has begun to intentionally not hand in their work when it is due. The maintaining trigger might be the negative thoughts that they have associated with the task. They may feel that the task is too difficult and that they're not able to do it correctly and too embarrassed to ask for help. A maintaining consequence may be that when the student has handed in their task in the past, they have received a poor mark. Their paper is covered in crosses, not ticks. The most effective means to address this behaviour would likely be to modify the consequences. We would pair a punishing consequence, such as doing rubbish duty after recess, with a reinforcing consequence to encourage helpful behaviour, such as saying, "I'm proud of you for trying your best," when they do hand in their homework.
Let's look at a range of potential triggers and consequences which could be modified in the classroom. Minimizing external triggers may include shutting windows to reduce outside noise, for example, if there's construction work outside or noise traveling from nearby classrooms, using natural lighting rather than artificial lighting, monitoring the temperature of the classroom depending on the outside weather, using air fresheners, and considering the general classroom layout, such as seating plans and the position of the board. Minimizing personal triggers in the classroom may involve implementing emotional regulation strategies, ensuring the children have access to recess and lunch to prevent hunger, which could involve a school-based initiative to provide emergency lunches for those students who come to school hungry. We want to aim to maintain a positive teaching attitude in the classroom, have a quiet or chill out area for students if they feel overwhelmed or in an emotionally sensitive state, and regular mindfulness activities in class, such as yoga and meditation time.
So those are possible modifications that we can make to the triggers, but what about consequences? Modifying the consequences of a behaviour should consider the effects of punishment versus reinforcement. To address unhelpful problem behaviours, the consequence should be punishing, so the student learns to not repeat that behaviour. This might include verbal reprimands, for example, a verbal warning, if the school has an established 3 warning system, timeouts. The general rule of thumb for a timeout is that it should be minute per age. So for example, a 5-year-old would stay back for 5 minutes. Loss of privileges, such as not listening to music during independent work, or the student might even be sent to the office. When consistent over time, these punishments make it less likely for the student to continually repeat the unhelpful behaviour. To encourage and reward alternative helpful behaviours, the consequence should be reinforcing so that the student is more likely to demonstrate this behaviour instead of the previous unhelpful behaviour. This might be activity-based, such as being able to play a game at the end of the lesson, social reinforcement, such as a high five or a smile, something material, such as a sticker or stamp, in which a classroom token system can encourage students to accumulate a certain number of tokens to receive a award, or other privileges, such as being able to choose where they sit. These reinforcements will encourage students to exhibit more consistent, helpful behaviours. We need a consistent form of both punishment for unhelpful behaviours and reinforcement of helpful behaviours. This will help to discourage the unhelpful behaviour and replace it with encouraging the alternative helpful behaviour.
It's important to note that for behaviour change to be effective, modifications to antecedents and consequences should be consistent across all settings. However, all we can do is try our best. It's difficult and unrealistic for every teacher to know what goes on beyond the classroom for every student. We can't track or monitor every possible factor that influences a student's behaviour. There may be triggers or outcomes occurring at home which maintain certain behaviours and different expectations for behaviour at home than in the classroom. Though, doing our best means making sure our modifications are as consistent as possible in the school environment so that the student may distinguish what behaviours are expected and rewarded versus harmful and punished within a learning environment. Practically, it's important that all teachers who interact with the student are aware of the possible triggers and the target consequences so that they can appropriately respond to behaviours as they occur. If there is an opportunity to liaise with parents and discuss how behaviour occurs or is managed at home, do so. Find out about their triggers, behaviours, and consequences at home, and be willing to provide the school's perspective with your specific behaviour targets and any recommendations.
It's also important to note that some students have a heightened susceptibility to the behavioural triggers we discussed earlier. This includes students with ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, ASD or autism spectrum disorder, ODD, oppositional defiance disorder, and persistent toxic stress and trauma. For example, we know that children with ADHD show symptoms of inattentiveness and/or hyperactivity and impulsivity. These can be presented as behaviours such as not doing schoolwork, calling out, and running around the classroom, which are unhelpful behaviours. Similarly, we know that children with ASD have heightened sensitivity to stimuli such as light, noise, smell, and touch. An increase in these triggers can lead to breakdowns, screaming, and rejection of schoolwork. Again, behaviours that we classify as unhelpful. Students dealing with significant toxic stress and trauma are also susceptible to persistent unhelpful behaviours. Ongoing negative circumstances will impact the student emotionally, cognitively, and physiologically, acting as a trigger on their behaviour. These students are typically viewed as the naughty student, though we must appreciate that there is more going on than intentional naughtiness. It's a cycle of established behaviour patterns which require targeted intervention or modifications to establish and support more helpful behaviours.
For these students, we need to consider behaviour across a trajectory, as this will influence when it is and isn't effective to implement the ABC model. In this blue stage, a student is calm and in an ideal state for learning. It's easier and more likely that the student will demonstrate helpful learning behaviours. They are attentive, focusing on their work to the best of their ability and not disrupting others. Alternatively, this yellow stage represents a student who is agitated due to some form of personal or environmental trigger. As this becomes more disruptive to the student's thoughts, they progress into the orange stage and begin to show signs of a potential outburst. Students may arrive at school in this yellow or orange state. For students with ADHD, this may be due to a resting state of inattentional hyperactivity, or for students experiencing stress or trauma due to situations occurring at home. We need to monitor these children carefully. Students in this stage may show red flags of unhelpful behaviours: being too quiet, being distractible, calling out, not completing their work or participating in tasks, and being restless. Every child's behaviour and ways of expressing how they're feeling is different. So it's important that teachers take the time to get to know their students and their ways in which they, although indirectly, let them know that they're not quite in that ready to learn state. This yellow-orange area is also a crucial time frame to implement strategies which aim to bring the students back into the blue, ready to learn stage. Strategies may include asking the child if they would like to go and get some water or have a break outside, have some quiet time in the quiet chill out space of the room, or potentially even modifying the task so it's less daunting or cognitively demanding to that child.
However, if these red flags are not detected or strategies aren't implemented in this phase, or the strategies are unsuccessful, the child will likely escalate into the red stage, the crisis stage, at the pinnacle of the scale. Some students may escalate to this zone in a matter of seconds, while others build up over days. Once a student is in this crisis stage, it's too late to implement strategies or attempt to calm them down. We must wait out the outburst and focus on keeping the child from harming themselves or others. If the child absconds or uses violent behaviours, teachers have a responsibility to maintain the safety of that student and other students, which can be a tricky prioritisation. It's important to follow school protocols to mitigate the situation and minimise risk, which might include evacuating the classroom or phoning the office to inform them of the situation so that you aren't compromising the safety of all learning of the other students. During this stage, the teacher or adult must also control their own anxiety to help diffuse the student's anxiety. We must also carefully consider the use and timing of punishments and/or reinforcements in this situation. It's a tricky balance between not wanting to punish a child for their emotions whilst avoiding any encouragement of the outburst and wanting to establish productive, alternative behaviours without suggesting that the outburst will always lead to attention. For the students who are frequently escalating to this red zone, it's important to provide them with individualised or distracting transitional tasks, such as drop everything and read, to de-escalate their emotions and behaviour. Once the student begins to cool off back into the green recovery stage, you can begin implementing those strategies again and try to get them back into ready to learn. However, it's important to recognise that it can take hours to days for children to move out of the red stage, particularly if their home environment is fueling this behaviour and their stress levels.
We want you to walk away from this presentation with some useful, highly practical strategies to manage behaviour in your own classroom. One resource includes an ABC form. This will help to track the behaviours of students you are particularly interested in overcoming unhelpful behaviours and monitoring effective measures for introducing alternative, helpful behaviours. It will help you clearly track what antecedent and/or consequence surrounded a particular behaviour and therefore what can be modified to resolve the problem behaviour. Another strategy to adopt is the red, yellow, green light or stop, think, do approach to communicate behaviour management to students themselves. This goes hand in hand with the school-wide 3 warning strategy that we mentioned earlier. These strategies are self-empowering to encourage students to stop, think about their situation, consider different options for behaviour, and choose the best, most helpful behaviour for that situation, and avoid receiving 3 warnings which would result in a larger consequence.
In summary, behaviours can be helpful or unhelpful. The ABC model can be used to decrease unhelpful behaviours and increase helpful behaviours. We can achieve this by minimising triggers and modifying consequences. Some students have a heightened susceptibility to these triggers, such as students with ADHD, ODD, and trauma. And it's imperative that teachers get to know their students so that they can identify their behaviours and thus when strategies need to be implemented.
That concludes our presentation on behaviour management. We thank you for your time and interest and hope you're able to take some valuable information with you into the classroom. We're open to provide any additional information or support. If you do have questions, please feel free to contact our supervisor, Julia Hind. Thank you.